Welcome, everybody. This is session number two out of three. This is a joint collaboration between me, Anna Silva, and the scientific writing brand that I created. We developed this series to train young researchers on some important concepts about writing papers, reading papers, and many other aspects of scientific writing. So today's topic is on how to read a scientific publication because it's someone that might not have much experience on the writing itself when it's faced at the start of its research. One of the first steps, of course, it is to read a lot of literature. So today, what I propose and invite you to is to walk you through a few steps that should help you quite a lot to understand and evaluate the quality and type of research and the scientific message that are given to you. Right. I'm going to give you very practical tools as well to support you in terms of learning how to understand the strong and less strong points of any paper, or in that way, of any scientific work that you read, because that should actually help you making a very important decision, which is this piece of work important and relevant to me, first of all, and second of all, is it good enough? Is the quality and the type of research one that sounds sound and that is actually verified and validated, and can I actually take consideration the messages and the research itself and evaluate if I should I not cite this work, because our responsibilities as authors of papers is also to decide which references to bring into our own manuscripts, and for that reason it's very important for us to screen if that research has quality and the results are validated and the interpretation supported by the data that is being presented. So I'm going to try and give you some protocols and directions on how you can make this decision in a much more informed way. So first of all, I would introduce you to what I call the fast reading sequence. Most of the time, all of us are facing with a lot of papers to read simultaneously. There's a lot of publications coming out, and we have to keep ourselves updated if we also want to write our manuscripts in relation to the current state of art. So it helps to be able to actually read and make decisions upon the papers. Is it interesting and relevant to me or not really? So this fast reading sequence is there to try to give you a first idea if the paper actually is pretty good. So I would suggest for you to start with the abstract, particularly the key points of the abstract. And I'm assuming here that the abstract is well written, that is has at least four main message, which is what was done and why, how was done, what was found, and what does it mean. Those are the key message of any scientific research. So a good abstract, if it is complete in the space allocated by the journal, should give you this information. And that's pretty much the visiting card of a manuscript. Those are the essential points of the research. And you can start reading the abstract. And if you find something there is interesting, then that should push you forward to read the rest of the manuscript. Now, what you have to realize is that not all papers that get published are written in the best possible way. It depends also, of course, on the experience of writing of the first author. So in that regard, I would advise you also to consider looking at the conclusion section, if there is one. If there isn't, normally it corresponds to the last paragraph of the discussion. And here is where you can find the wrapping up points. Normally, the authors introduce here two main pieces of information. And that is the impacts, let's call it contributes of the research, how it becomes a game changer in the current state of the art, and what should be the future steps. So if you identify their contributions as relevant to your own research or to the context where you're in, then this might also be an important piece of information to help you make this decision. From this point onwards, you should have already, or with these two main sections or elements read of a paper, what you can do next is look at the discussion. because that's normally there where the authors insert the new into the old. Their own new results are interpreted in the context of the state of the art. So it explains where the conclusions come from. And normally, a shortcut that I can give you inside the discussion is to look at the first paragraph, because normally it's standardized pretty much everywhere. The authors always start the first paragraph with a summary of the main findings and the answer to the research question they posed in the introduction. So they start closing the story normally in the first paragraph, and that's where you can get perhaps the most juicy information, if I could put it like that, of the paper, because it's the answer to the research question and have they met the objective or not. Next, consider reading the introduction, because here is where you find the motivation behind this research. And if you, here you can find potential inspiration also to relate to your research, and what are the relevant contexts that their findings, their conclusions can be considered within. Okay, so it might be important also, if you wish to dig a little bit further, to consider the introduction. The methods and the results is where you pretty much get certification, an idea of the quality of the research itself, because the objectives might be presented in the introduction, might be valid and interesting, but the approach to meet them has to be scientifically sound. So the methods is there to give detail about that. So as you get a little bit more experience, and with today's solutions I'm going to be giving you, you should be able to make a decision. Is their approach to the objective sound? Is it plausible? And is it the best one? Does it have any sort of limitation? Because if there's something wrong in the methodology of a research, wrong or missing or limited, that should influence the interpretation of the results in the discussion. So the discussion is always bounded by what is the reach and the boundaries of the method section. So it helps a lot. It's one of the things that the reviewers start going through as soon as they get a paper to review, is look at the methods in relation to the objective. And if they feel that is not the right approach, or if the amount of data collected or the type of data collected is not suitable, or the data analysis, they can immediately reject the paper, because everything downstream from the method is going to be compromised because it has some inherent flaw that hampers the results validity, let's say. The results themselves are the evidence supporting the conclusion. So one of the things you can also do, at least to decide, is this the research outcome itself, is it interesting to me, besides being influenced, of course, by the authors, by reading the abstract and conclusion, is look at the images and the tables and whatever is the output they put here, and make your own interpretation before you get influenced by the authors. And then that way you can also judge if the information appeals to you, or if you find it relevant to your own context. So this is like, you can stop anywhere in this sequence. Normally the abstract and the conclusion and eventually the discussion are enough elements if the paper is well written, and normally the best ones are published in the best journals. Then you have enough information to at least decide, is the context, is the scope of this research interesting to me or not. Some sidelight techniques you might wish to consider is to read the first and last couple of sentences within each heading or subheadings that all of these main three sections can have. So it's very often for the sections to be subdivided by self-explanatory headings within them. And normally the first and last couple of sentences in those headings have at least what was being targeted and what was found, or the motivations behind it. So if you don't have much time, this can be a shortcut. What I would strongly advise you, particularly to get practice as a reader and also as an author, is to annotate as you read. Because at the moment you might be reading a particular paper, but you actually might be using it in your own manuscript much later on in a different timeline. So it helps while you're reading and making a decision on the quality of the manuscript to annotate what you found were limitations, applications to your reality, underline keywords and arguments, and even summarize key points. So later on, when you actually consider citing this work, you already have some work done on how can I use this paper in my own research context and up to what extent, because it might have or not limitations that hamper your inclusion of this reference in your own argumentation. For this final technique, this annotation, I strongly recommend for you to consider a free tool. It's called Scholarly. At least it can, it has a free version, and it's very good because you can use it as a consulting source. Later on, we're actually writing that you can create a library that corresponds to the papers you've read, and you can annotate in there the papers themselves and your own annotations of the positive and, let's say, less positive aspects of the work and how you think you might use it in your own research. So this is kind of a fast reading approach to try to understand what do you have in front of you. Is it good enough and is it interesting enough? Now, what is important for you to realize is that the different sections have different functions. So these next couple of slides show you that allocation of key information. So in the abstract is where you, here, by the way, the size of these bubbles correspond to what should be actually found there in a more evident way. So in a good abstract, this is where you can find for sure information that enables you to decide on the quality of the research, because normally the abstracts have a lot of information on the methods. Very often is methods and the results, they co-share let's say the amount of space, the most amount of space, up to 50% or more of the space that is given to write an abstract. And the reason is that the readers with the abstract, which pretty much is a visiting card of any publication, they can, in that small visiting card, understand if that approach to the objective that was given, is it sound, is it good enough, does it make sense? And then afterwards, what a good abstract should also focus on is on the impacts, the contributes. So you can find in the abstract both four main pieces of information in summary. Their relevance, normally the first sentence gives you the topic importance plus its current pertinence. So why is it important now to look at this topic instead of any other? Then it gives you the scope, normally in the second or third sentence, that corresponds to the objective of the work. And then a lot of the information, a lot of the sentences are dedicated to methods, results, and then normally the last couple of sentences are dedicated to the impact. So if you want to evaluate, can this work be useful to me? Abstract can particularly give you a lot of information related to the quality and the impact of the research itself, okay? In opposition, if you're more concerned about identifying the relevance or the scope of the work, then you should go for the introduction. So problems, gaps in knowledge, and limitations are expected to be given in the introduction, because that's where researchers have, or authors have, to position their manuscript in relation to others. So they have to justify the novelty, why there is a need for this research at the moment, and what do they propose themselves to do in terms of either completing an objective and in that way solving a problem, or contributing to address a gap in knowledge, either partially or totally. The scope is also very important in introduction, because it's in here that you will find the main objective, and within that objective, where were the specific aims. Normally at the end of the introduction is where you find the specific research questions. And those are very important for you to read, to evaluate the manuscript, because you have to relate if what they set themselves to do, does it correspond to the quality of the methodology that they use to address it? Because each specific aim will have its own, let's say, data needs. And this correspondence between aim and approach and collection of evidence that's going to be analyzed and presented in the results, that's very important. That's a very important quality check that all reviewers do, but you as an author or as a reader of papers can also do by yourself, and you should, in order to understand the in your own field, it's very important to have the sensitivity, well, to reach this sort of aim that might be more or less ambitious, more or less comprehensive. Then this is the magnitude and type of data that I need to collect and analyze. And you should get that sensitivity as early as you can. And then hopefully what happens is that the method section corresponds to a lot of detail on how to meet each specific aim. The introduction does not have much, but it is expected at some point that the authors also include expected contributions. So normally is by having this objective, we set ourselves to achieve or to contribute to this solving this problem or to achieve some sort of advancement in the state of the art. I would advise you to skim read the introduction to find the study motivation. It should be very close to the objective, and I think it's one of the key informations to find in any given paper. Don't take it for granted it'll be in the abstract. You normally have to skim the introduction to find it, but I think it's very useful for you to understand what did them set themselves to do. And with under those lights, you can better understand later on, particularly the discussion why they interpreted their results, their new evidence in this direction instead of the other. Well, because in the introduction, the scope, the motivation that was behind the study was a particular one. So it's quite important to understand it early on. To find quality and limitations of the research, hopefully what you will have to go through is look at the methods data, section. Here is where you will be able to evaluate the quality of the research based on the data variability and any sort of validation that the authors might have imparted into this section. Very often we have to pre-validate our approach to collect preliminary data and validate models and test preliminary steps in order to proceed with the main approach, with the main technique, let's say. So here is where particular reviewers and you as a reader of paper can get reassurance on what is the data quality, and is it good enough and enough in terms of quantity as well to address the objectives they set themselves to achieve. The limitations is also something you can definitely find here in the methods. It can work two ways. It either is explicitly said in the methods where are the limitations of the work, or normally that is addressed as a subsection within the discussion. If you don't find it within the discussion, then I would advise you to go through the methods and try to evaluate in relation to similar researchers. Do they have more or less data sets and quality of data? And is the data analysis actually the best one, or at least suitable to the type of data analyzed? So skim read the methods to find the methodological scope. I'm talking about the power of analysis, number of replicates, validations of proofs and choices. It's very important for look for argumentation here, because normally any choice of how the data was handled has to be addressed in the method. So this is how the authors defend themselves from criticism, and they get validation on the next session on the results, because they argue and they use references to support the decision. We use A instead of B because. And because it's part of any type of research to have to make decisions and to select a sample in order to withdraw conclusions of the larger population. So look for that here, because it will give you, if it's there, it'll give you a first impression exactly where are the limitations of the study. The results are basically there as a source of the evidence, and this is where you find quality of the paper as well, because you can have evidence or results that are only, let's say, almost categorically analyze a very exploratory analysis, like average comparisons or histograms or correlations, or even no statistical analysis. So if you look at the results section and you don't see statistical analysis, or at least strong proofs and validation techniques as an outcome being presented, then you might get a bit suspicious. Well, there might be ambitious objectives, but the data nature and type and quantity and the analysis they were able to perform doesn't enable to have strong and confident interpretations. And the rule is normally if you're collecting quantitative data that has some experimental design associated with it, or even proofs that you can validate with databases or the existing data. If you can apply statistical analysis to it, the more power you gain in interpretations. So normally you can check for quality of the manuscript to see by seeing do they have statistical analysis, and if yes, of what nature. The stronger the analysis, like factorial analysis, um, are a strong indicator that the conclusions that are going to be presented to you in the discussion are more, let's say, reliable, believable, because they're backed up by statistical proofs. If they're showcasing trends and averages and just ordination plots and something that has not been mathematically analyzed, then there's more room for, let's say, not subjective interpretation, but for more diversity of powers of interpretation between the readers and the authors. In the discussion is also where you can find strong clues in terms of quality of the manuscript. This is where the interpretation contexts are given to you, because any results can be interpreted or put into different contexts. It depends on the intention of the author. And what we are doing here as readers of this work is believing or not the author when he says this result fits into this aspect of the state of the art. So the author chooses which contexts are relevant to compare my results to and to insert them. And it's us readers, we have to look at this argumentation and believe, hopefully, in the claims that the author is doing. So normally there's a lot of argumentation going on where if the reader is backing up their interpretations with existing references, we get a sense that yes, it's quite clear that this study is similar, is it different, is advancing the state of the art in some way, because the speech, let's say the text itself in terms of interpretation context, will be very close to what you've been exposed to in the introduction, but they're trying to showcase how the new evidence advances the field. The relevance, of course, it's something that is very expressive in the discussion because it's up to the authors, if the discussion is well written, to identify what does it mean to have this new piece of the puzzle into the existing one. So what are the changes in the state of art based on this new information about the system functioning that we did not have before? There's some scope also present in the discussion, in the sense that the good discussion identifies if the objective was fulfilled or not, partially or totally, and what is exactly the answer to the research questions that set themselves to get an answer in the introduction and or the specific objectives. So you will also find at the start of the discussion, normally the first sentence will give you an idea of the fulfillment of the objective. The conclusion, if there is one as a separate section, is this is where you go to find impact in terms of in what way and in what magnitudes is this research a game changer. Okay, so a good conclusion should have all the changes that the authors claim that should occur in the current study of the system. Okay, because they will identify that, okay, based on what we found, these are the consequences for our current understanding. Therefore, we should address these issues in a different way. And let's say the more ambitious the paper, the more impacts you'll find here. Now, the trick is to try to read in the vocabulary if you can identify magnitudes and directions of these changes and these impacts. Because very often the authors protect themselves from criticism, and the impact can here correspond to a little bit of extrapolation. But this is also where the authors identify value of the research. So if you are trying to make a decision, is this manuscript actually pretty pretty good? Is it going to become, or is it already referenced in the field? Normally, good papers that have a lot of impact, so two, three, or at least a few of them, uh, correspond to very impactful papers. And this is also where you find the next step. So if you might wish to get, for instance, ideas or inspirations for a new line of research, going through the last part of the conclusions where you can find perhaps, let's say, inspiration, because it's where the authors identify what is the next step, or at least future research directions. So this few slides, this couple of slides, identify to you well. If you're looking for quality, go here and here. If you're looking for relevance, go here and there. For scope, for impact. So this is kind of a matching image and diagram to guide you on what to look for what, okay, in terms of the typical IMRAD sections that the journals normally use, the vast majority of them. As I said in the previous video, the names of this section might vary a little bit, but this type of information will be found in the corresponding titles that you're going to be easy. It's going to be easy for you to correspond and to see the relationship between these standardized section names and others that have some variation between journals. Do you have any questions so far? Am I being helpful? Or what is at the moment your approach to read the paper? How does it work for you? And how do you make a decision? Is this paper useful for me?
Yeah, my approach has been very wrong, so I'm glad I got to listen to this. I would just.
It was a different approach, but tell me, please. You might have positive aspects.
Yeah, I would just like read the paper in just sequence.
Through and
like,
through?
Yeah. And then it was kind of confusing because then I would see like some results and I would I would think like how does this work so on? And my professor would just tell me this is not even important to the final result of the paper. Like you don't need to be concerned with this. Just just use it as a hyperlink.
Okay.
You're pretty much the same for me, just reading it in order.
In order, all right, okay. Well, it makes sense if you want to go in depth, and because you think it's going to be a reference for you, then you want to follow in many aspects, either from contextualizing the importance of this research at the moment, what was their angle in the introduction, and can I get inspired by that for my own writing, or did they make a strong claim that this study actually is important to have at the moment? And in that sense, if you go through the entire sections in a sequence, you'll get the full storyline. But what you have to understand is that this is something that perhaps young readers and young researchers don't have yet a good sensitivity for, which is uh, papers are not necessarily well written. The science might be amazing and the research question quite novel and it's going to be a game changer no matter what the results. But not all researchers are trained and, let's say, gifted in terms of writing the storyline. So you have to train yourselves to have a critical eye to identify where are the strong points and where are the weaknesses, either of the research or how the story was set up. Because if you read through and through without a critical eye, you might be missing important information that actually should let's say, tone down your excitement about the contribution of the work because you were able to identify things that perhaps the authors didn't address. And that should work for you a little bit as a hampering of potentially the usefulness of the research, or at least the manuscript itself. Because you have to understand, as authors of papers, if you are citing a reference, a previous published work, you are claiming to the scientific community that you believe in that research that you're citing and that you agree with the conclusions that were given within. And this type of critical decision and judgment has to be done individually. Each researcher has to make this decision individually. Is this work good enough and correct in my view in order for me to cite it in my research, in my manuscript? Otherwise, you might also incur in something that's very dangerous in science, which is propagating error. Okay, so we should be reading the papers in a critical way. The science might be fine. Normally, that's what the reviewers validate quite thoroughly. It's the science. It's also, of course, the manuscript angles and the scope and how the storyline is set up. But very often, the reviewers are not particular experts on that scientific field. They know enough about it to validate and to judge, but they don't work on a daily basis on that specific topic. So they might leave some aspects, let's say, unchecked because of that reason. So it's up to us authors when we're reading papers and deciding, should I cite this or not? We have to evaluate the quality of the science. Hopefully that should already be sound because it was validated by the reviewers and the editors of the journals. But then the claims, the argumentations made in the storyline, that's up to us authors to evaluate and judge. So hopefully what this, let's say, even the fast sequence that I gave you before, even this this protocol where to find what should or can be considered as a very important tool to at least to make you look at important aspects of the work that the author might not have explicitly addressed, and you have to actively search for them. We're going to be talking about how to identify flaws in the and weaknesses, either in the document and in the research, and that's very important. So with this couple of slides, I want you to be aware of where is what type of information is expected where in terms of quality, relevance, scope, impact, etc. So it's a good idea to get this sensitivity. But I wouldn't say your approach is wrong. Your approach is normally more time consuming. And if you're not looking at it with a critical eye and trying to find some of the aspects we're going to be covering today, you might be missing opportunities that will help you in the end to be a better author because it would change your mindset in terms of the reading point of view. So yeah, I forgot to address this in terms of tips. In the conclusion, normally what I mentioned it, but in a bit more detail, the vocabulary and the number and magnitude of the implications should be important signals for you to pick up on, is this research a game changer and how much impactful it actually is? Because strong wording is going to be used. If yes, more and percentage or quantifications of those implications normally are made. So the stronger the impression you get by reading, normally the more important and the more quality can be associated with this research. In terms of bibliography, be aware of if it's very short, and you will get an idea of the standardized number of references for your own field by reading the journals of your area. If you find a paper that is quite short bibliography, put yourselves a little bit from the outside and think, well, if there's a short bibliography, normally means the introduction scope is very narrow. Because they were not able to identify a lot of contact points between the research objective and the existing state of the art. And in the discussion, exactly the same thing, because the introduction in the discussion is where the vast majority of references are inserted. So if there's a short bibliography, normally means that the impact and the ambition of the research and of course the output or the perceived quality of the manuscript might be a bit lesser because of those reasons. So they were not able to contextualize so much and to compare so much what they've got with the existing state of the art. I'm going to show you as an example, these two papers we used in the last video. I'm going to go back to them just to showcase to you what we are actually looking for. So this is a tool of game theoretic models of security for cryptocurrencies. And I've mentioned in the abstract, you should be able, if it's well written, you will find let's say the summary of the entire work. It's kind of the visiting card and has four main pieces of information. What was done and why, how it was done, what was found, and what it means. So if you look at this example, the first sentence actually gives us that. Cryptocurrencies have gotten much attention in recent years, both from academic community and industry. So this is the topic. And why is it important now? Because it recently has been received a lot of attention in two different contexts. And then shortly after that, in the next sentence, there's the gap, there's the motivation behind the work. We know something, one interesting aspect of cryptocurrencies is, yet many open problems still exist and current systems rarely deal with something else. So this is a very good sentence that immediately signals to the reader, here's the gap, here's the problem that most likely we're going to set ourselves to achieve. Okay. And they give a little bit more theory behind it. What is missing in this abstract, for instance, is immediately after this gap, the specific objective of the research. So this is something I would change in this abstract. And as I've been saying so far, don't trust that the abstract will have necessarily all the information you're looking for. So this one doesn't really have it here. You can derive it from basically from the result, which actually comes much later. With this work, we offer a systemization of the work that relates to this problem, okay? By considering papers that do this and do that. Okay, so this is the main result, and from it, we can actually withdraw backwards, we obtain the objective, but it should be given in a much more direct way. And then the conclusion or the impact or the contributor of the work, it's in the final sentence, and apparently it is there, a bit disguised. This gives an overview of available tools, and we look at their potential use in practice. So let's say the main contribute to the essence and the take-home message of this work, and to help you make a decision, is interesting for me or not, is if you're looking for information that tells you how these tools can be used in practice. That was their contribution in the end, their objective. Okay, so most of the information expected is here, not necessarily, and in that regard, you might have to look for other sections for the information, but this one is pretty reasonably well written. So in that sense, it could be a good first approach to decide, is this research interesting to me, and does it sound sound and valid? In terms of the objective, what is it, what it was, and what was their approach to achieve the objective? Do I believe and find that that's a good approach? As I said before, the end of the introduction, which is here, by the way, it's quite a short one, is where you find also the specific aims and the objectives. So if you don't find in the abstract, like in this case, you can go to the end of the introductions, hopefully there, and in this case it is. Here we consider the ways in which models in DS, in cryptography, distributed systems can, etc., and so forth. So I'm not going to go into more detail. So they're looking at the practical ways where these models can be applied. In the conclusion is where I mentioned you can find the impacts and the next steps. And it is also where you get a feeling how much of a game changer this work is. So if you read the abstract, you read perhaps the end of the introduction in this case because information was missing on the objective, and you go straight to the conclusion, you should be able to connect the dots between, okay, they set themselves to do this because of this reason. So this is the objective and the motivation. They attempt to address a currently important topic. And what they found changes the field in some way. Well, it changes in the way that with this paper, we'll now be able to understand how existing concepts can be used in specific applications. You don't find here the details on how it can be applied in what context and in what systems, but it's a summary of the contribution. If you want more of that detail, you have to go to the discussion. And then you also find the next step. It will be interesting to see a new theory built from, etc., etc. So this is where you also might get inspiration. Or for our second example, if I go through that paper, we can do a very similar exercise. If I zoom in a little bit. So cloud computing services has altered information sharing and storage behavior. So this is current state of the art. Immediately, so it introduces the topic of the research. Next, this study investigates this behavior and explores the paradox between industry reports and academic reports. Okay, so what is missing here in your opinion?
The results?
The results early in the abstract, would you expect that? Very, very early? So if you remember, the abstract will have 4 main pieces of information in this sequence. what was done and why, how was done, what was found and what it means. So what was found is the result. So I would expect that, not perhaps in the first couple of sentences, but a bit later in the abstract. So what do you get as a reader when you go through this first and second sentence? What do you feel that you're being given? What type of information?
It gives the context of the literature so far.
Yes. And then it gives the objective. But do you believe the objective as something that is needed and interesting? Is it set out? Is it described in a way that makes you feel, oh yeah, that sounds like a very interesting study to have? Because at the moment I'm missing vocabulary between the first and second sentence to tell me, okay, this is the topic, and at the moment this topic is important or it faces this problem. Therefore, it's implied we have this objective for this study. So this abstract is missing the motivation and the topic importance. And that is something very relevant from a reader because it helps making a decision. Yeah, it makes sense to talk about and to read this paper at the moment because they're addressing something that relates to my own day-to-day research. They are trying to address the same problem, the same gap, the same limitation that I have. Okay, so if you add or if you read this information in here as an author or as a reader, it should help the reader in making that decision. So definitely something that needs to be upgraded here. They do a little bit that here. Afterwards, the gap of the poem is slightly or in a very confusing way, perhaps given here, the next sentence. But it's still not easy to understand how this relates to the objective they set themselves to do. This is the specific objective exactly, which is not written. This study investigates this behavior and explores the paradox. Well, what does that mean to investigate and explore? Well, in actuality, it corresponds to developing a cloud computing usage model. And that was much more straightforward. And that's exactly what is the specific objective. So it could be well written. It goes a bit backwards and forwards, and it's not very easy to understand what is exactly the objective. They mix the information a bit up, and it gets a bit confusing. Then the vast majority of this is all the next sentence are all results. And then at the end, the contribution. The study contributes to the information systems, blah, 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 and it provides multiple implications for researchers in academia and industry. So it has useful information for sure to understand the scope, and it seems to be interesting, but they close their game. They imply multiple implications, but they don't say which and how. So it forces you to go perhaps to discussion and conclusion to get a bit more information. Is it interesting for me? Where are the contexts in academia and industry they addressed for me to decide? Yes, I want to read the entire paper because they're considering something that's important to me. So in that regard, I may actually have to go all the way down to conclusions and eventually discussions. I think they don't have a conclusion; they only have they have discussion and conclusion merge, which is an option. This is what I told you before. Normally, at the start of the discussion, it's where they revisit the aim and they say if they achieved it or what was the main outcome for that specific aim. So the aim of our study was, and they found something. It's probably given in the next couple of sentences. Here, they have something that is a very important clue for you immediately. They actually have a section called to the implications and limitations. So to find problems and flaws, this is a location to do it. And you can skim read it. I didn't go through the entire document in a careful way because I've trained myself to look at the start of the paragraphs. And this is a very neat trick that you can use. Normally, when you're trying to look for let's say the key message of any paragraph, the first sentence normally opens that key message, opens that topic. This is what I've done here. It's normally in the first or the second line. So for here, first, for instance, they're talking about study implications. Immediately they say, this is the first study proposing a model to study, etc. So they're implying novelty and they're implying usefulness because they develop a model that didn't exist before. What hopefully they should have done in the introduction, I didn't check, is that they made the case that we needed a model, that we needed a solution for exploring this type of topic. But if you want to skim read papers, one of the good ways is like that, is try to look for specific wording that signals to you something different. So this is another implication, the study unique findings. So this is marketing wording. Unique findings pertaining to this phenomenon have multiple implications. That was the end of the abstract, if you remember. Okay, and now they're going to address them all. First, we actually don't know how many. They should have said multiple should be actually be replaced with how many, because we don't know how many to expect from the reading point of view. But first, second, third, I don't know if there's fourth, there's another one here. And it's if you look at clues very rapidly, you should be able to find them quickly. So there are four main impacts of this study, which sounds very good because they identify at least four areas where what they learn can make a difference. And it's very useful from the reading point of view to identify them, to be given them in a very straightforward way. The second main paragraph is dedicated to the limitations. And this is something you can either find the methods or here in the discussion somewhere or at the end of the document. And you should be looking for this language very carefully. You might even go as far as do control search, to do a search in the document, control F, on limitation or something or similar, a synonym of that, because it's in your best interest to get exposure to what the authors believe are the hampering, the problems that limit or bound the interpretations and the claims they're made. So when you are reading what they say that these are contributes, you have to go through the limitations to put those contributions into a boundary and not to, let's say, realize that these four impacts apply in all circumstances. Probably not. And we have to be influenced by these limitations in order to understand what is the scope and the boundaries within the conclusions they took from their work. Okay. And then at the end of it, future research. So it's like it's reasonably similar, easy to train yourself. I'm not of this field. I'm a biologist, and I'm able to understand if the storyline is well set up and where are the clues to tell me if this is perhaps a good research. Are there many limitations and do they sound important? And where are the impacts and do they actually sound reasonable? They're well argued. And is the objective actually pretty ambitious? And did they collect evidence enough for that? And all of those things. This is something that even if you're not of the field, you might be able to do if you actually practice a little bit. I'm showing you two simple examples. They're not necessarily ideal or the opposite in any way. They're just used as real case scenarios. But I'm trying to train your way of reading to, okay, besides the science, looking at the structure and the key information that I'm looking for to judge the quality of manuscript, this is where I'm going to go to find this and to that and that. And then you're going to have to make a reasonable judgment based on what's being said. The idea is to change a little bit your perception. It will all come down to practice. Of course, this presentation is here to try to open you for new tools, new ways of reading papers and making use of them in your own best interest. But as with everything, and as with writing, reading also implies practice. So what I would encourage you, for instance, to do if you are at a very early stage of your career, is to read, in terms of looking for these things, and perhaps using the slides as a guide, go and find a paper of the top journal of your field or the top conference proceeding, and one that has been published, let's say, in a less well-known, more obscure journal. And try to practice yourself to identify these issues. Where is the impact? Where are the objectives? What are the methods? Is it well argued? How they propose themselves to achieve the objective, the motivations, the flaws. Are those things there and where, and do I believe them? And compare with a very well written paper, which is normally corresponds to the top journal of your field, and one that perhaps is less, let's say, less demanding. And in that way, you can get a very clear sensitivity what you as an author can do to be more clear and more helpful in terms of persuading the reader to go through your entire manuscript and citing you. Because what's happening from the writing point of view and the opportunities that we as authors have is to persuade the reader, look, what I have to offer is something that you want and it's going to be important to you in this way. That's why it's important, that concept I mentioned in the last video, which is the concept of target audience. We have to write this argumentation and these types of information in a way that becomes appealing to that audience. So in that aspect, we have to carefully and in a conscious way write sentences that signal to the reader, here's the motivation, here's the limitations, here are the impacts, here are this, here are that. And this is what we are looking for in terms of reading, because again, it helps us to decide the quality of the manuscript and of the research, and that's important for referencing purposes. Now, in terms of finding flaws in the research itself, I'm going to be showing you the next slide on the document in terms of how it was written, the storyline. So in terms of research, what can you find as important flaws? And this is something that you have to actively train yourself to identify. You need to know your field in terms of what are normally the types of techniques that are used for what type of research. You need to be aware of those things because they will enable you to identify things like this, these important flaws. Inappropriate experimental design. So we're talking about a flawed data set that was used in order to meet the objective. It might not be the ideal one. It might have strong limitations or scope and is not suitable to test the objective that was proposed. You will find information to make this judgment on the experimental design in the method section, and it has a very serious implication. Well, if the data set that was fed into the proofs, into the validation of the model is already flawed and actually limits very much the interpretation of any potential outcome, the results, then these results become invalid or at least very limited in terms of scope of interpretation. So it's very important to check for these things. Another important flaw in the research itself is insufficient evidence supporting the conclusions. And by that, it means that the authors are going way beyond what the results enable them to go. It's like, imagine a scenario where they only work with European data sets, and now they're extrapolating and claim what we learn with the European context are applicable worldwide. So we have implications set in the context of the world globally. Well, that's actually not likely, and it's probably not suitable and correct because the data boundaries set you up to European level, so you cannot extrapolate that far. Okay, so this can happen, and you find this extrapolation in this way over, let's say, interpretations beyond boundaries in the results, and most likely in the discussion. And the consequences that the discussion goes in directions and scopes and contexts that probably are not believable and are not supported by the evidence. Unstandardized methodology, which correspond to deviations from common practices. You find them in the methods, and normally they make the results invalid for specific context interpretation. So again, get familiarized with the approaches, the techniques, the way people do the type of research that you might also be interested in. So get familiarized with the techniques, and if you find something unusual, try to understand why they use this different methodology. What are the expected benefits that they claim to have, and do you believe them? Non-replicable results is also a serious flaw. It means that there's not enough detail in the methods enabling repeating the experiment or the study itself. So it corresponds to poor results that might not be actually validated because they did not tell us all the specific steps and decisions made in collecting and analyzing the data. So the results might actually be by chance and not necessarily by the structure of the analysis, a result of the structure of the analysis. And if we don't have detail, if anyone repeats a study and exactly with the same protocol and doesn't get to the same outcome, then that invalidates the results and invalidates the research itself. It has happened before, and these papers have to be retracted, withdrawn, because actually some important methodological step was not given, was not shared, and that implied different results. So the implication is there's lack of field interest in application. And finally, in terms of research, poor data analysis. This involves you getting familiarized how data is treated in your field. So absent, wrong, or weak statistical techniques might be important signals to look for in the methods. And what happens is that if this type of research is consequently cited and referenced, is propagating an error in the sense that, well, the outcomes are not, in the first instance, the reviewer didn't pick up on this, unfortunately. What it means is that we are propagating the claims that are based on flawed research, or at least the data analysis had some inherent problems that might compromise the interpretation of the results. So that's also important to look at. Document flaws. We already mentioned the incomplete abstract. Okay, we covered that in the examples. Unworthy emphasis on the gap in knowledge. So this means there's a poor positioning of the study importance in relation to the state of the art. Very often it corresponds to topics of little interest, and it actually puts the author credibility into question. You should be looking for this in the abstract in the introduction. And normally means that they either set themselves to, let's say, to solve the entire problem, but then the objective doesn't correspond to, or they identify a gap in knowledge of magnitude that the research does not correspond to. And you get a feeling of mismatch between, okay, the introduction says they're going to be looking at this very important topic and try to solve this very important problem. But then when you look at the objective and their approach, you don't get that sort of match in a healthy way. So there's too much emphasis on the gap in knowledge that is not covered by the scope of the research objective. Lack of conclusion. So when there's no contributions or no clear advancements to the state of the art, we've seen we can find them at the end of the discussion in the conclusion. And these papers normally are published in the less impactful journals. Perceived quality is measured by a factor called journal impact factor, which is a number. So the rule is the higher the number, the better the perceived prestige of the journal and the research that gets published there. So when there's lack of conclusions, normally these papers don't get published in the top journals. And as a reader, what you get at the end of reading the discussion, okay, so what? You've done all of these things, but what does it mean to me? How does it change my research reality? So they're a bit less well written. There's the opposite, over extrapolation, interpretations in the discussion beyond the study scope. Normally you find it in the discussion, and it can compromise the author credibility because they're trying to make interpretations beyond the context that are immediately associated with the research objective and its boundaries that are created by itself and by the methodology. Limitations not properly addressed, something like not having a paragraph dedicated to limitations or sections as we saw in that example. You have to look for this in the discussion. Are there any identified by the authors, and what do they mean for me to judge the storyline? Normally the authors tone down the importance of the limitations. You have to make your own decision. Okay, yeah, I believe in when they say that, okay, there was this limitation, but it doesn't really hamper our interpretation of the results. Because if it does, it might actually invalidate the study contributions. Common missing points and where to look. There's quite a few of them, and this slide can be quite vast, but I'm bringing here the most important ones. So normally what you're missing, this in terms of how the storyline was set up, you might be missing the contribution the interest and the significance. So things like how much the field changes and the state of art advanced. And those are the sections where you can find them, introduction, end of the discussion. The answer to the research question very often is missing from the start of the discussion. Alternative explanations, when they're testing a hypothesis or something that they found actually was not correct, an assumption, very often the discussion is not enriched by, okay, we thought it was this, actually it's not, but now we believe that's A, B, and C. That would actually be a very good contribution of the paper, because if found that this road is actually not useful, we found this is a dead end. But by knowing that that is a dead end, now we can consider road A, B, and C, which would not be plausible before knowing this. Identification of the problem and the hypothesis very often is missing. Okay, and what basically is the justification why this research now instead of any other. Data set size and relevance for the objective, things like the characteristics of the sample size or the data set being used in the methods. And often it also papers are missing boundaries of the study results that should limit the interpretation. And you look for those in the discussion. So in a way, what I'm implying is that with these slides, these are the important things for you to look for to be able to evaluate the quality of the research and of the manuscript itself. So I'm inviting you to look at the documents, not by the science, but specifically where are the sentences and paragraphs which tell me this, are they there, and not where I expect them to be, and how do they influence my perception of the story that I'm being tried to be persuaded that is the right one. In opposition, strong points, which is something you definitely want to use to identify if the paper is good for you. Novelty, contributions and impacts, advantages, applications, and assumptions supporting the novelty. So in terms of novelty, identification of gaps or problems and those addressed with the research, you will find them in the abstract and introduction. Contributions claimed and obtained, okay? Claim they're made in the introduction. This is by filling this gap or addressing this problem, our objective will have an important potential contribution. So it's a claim they're making. Then based on the results obtained, they withdraw conclusions, and in the discussion, they talk about the contributions verified by the evidence. Advantages, not disadvantages, but advantages as improved in existing alternative methods. So something that they learned that set themselves differently from the current way of doing things in the discussion and conclusion. Applications, identification of potential contexts and users of the new information. This is corresponds, for instance, for the example that we saw in that PDF, that published paper, where they say that the study had multiple implications in both the academic and industry contexts. So that's we found it at the end of the abstract, and we also found it in the discussion, okay, in a separate subsection. And assumptions supporting the novelty, claims backed by formal previous works, which normally correspond or can be found in the introduction. So these are where they basically say, well, we are doing what we're doing because it has been pointed out as important and much needed at the moment. So they support themselves backing up with previous work. Now, these are, let's say, you in front of a manuscript solution, so protocols and techniques whilst you're reading. And it should be a very good attitude, or at least initiative you should be taking to practice yourself to look for these things. It will make you better authors, better readers, better researchers, and later on better reviewers and journal editors. So it's incredibly powerful to try to get a sensitivity for these issues and get familiarized with where to find these positive and less positive aspects in order to evaluate the quality of the work that you're looking at. Now, Scholarcy, as I mentioned before in the previous video, is a tool that you might wish to consider for this. I'm going to showcase you. It can shorten the work in some ways. I'm going to show you how very quickly. Okay, so I'm opening one reference that I imported here into Scholarly. And why I'm talking about this tool, because it can help you a lot in very fast understanding what is the work about and is it good for me, because it has a thing called summary flashcard. And in this flashcard, it has many different features which you can explore, but I'll highlight the important ones. For instance, it brings here the abstract, and with this highlight key, it tells you what are the important points and what are the contributions. So if you're looking for these things, this algorithm does that for you. So it highlighted the topic, its importance. It highlighted one of the contributions and potentially the objective as well, and then some other important points as well. What it can also give you, the highlights. I find the highlights extremely useful, because what are they? These are bullet points of the sentences or the concepts that the algorithm found as the most important pieces of information taken as a summary of the entire work. So what you're looking at, these are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bullet points that the algorithm tells you these are the key information of the entire manuscript. So some comes from the introduction, some will be coming from other sections and so on. So for instance, we introduced several model extensions in order to enhance something, etc. This sounds like an impact or a contribution. In this work, we presented something and the improvement brings a reduction of etc. So I found this information as very important because it has quantification, and it also identified this point as important. They showed there was how an exchange protocol has been developed, what can be used to provide significant speed ups. So it went there to the entire manuscript and summarized in a few bullet points what are the key messages of the work. So even before you read the manuscript, you can use this tool, or afterwards, if later on, again, you retain this in your library, this reference, and when you come back much later, you can use this bullet points to remember yourself, oh, why is this paper important to me? Or you can do something else, which is to edit these highlights. You can even add, so you can add your own annotation as you're going through the paper. Say, oh yeah, this is an important point and contact point for me to bring to my own manuscript and my own research. So you bring it here, even if the algorithm didn't bring it automatically, or you can even edit the ones that it did. So it's pretty useful to use as an annotation database and library as you read, or to be the first impression you get from a paper, not by your own reading, but by this type of tool that does that for you. And it does it for even for that was the highlights. It does that, those type of summaries for all the sections. First with the introduction, then all the sections that the paper has in there embedded. It will go through them and identify what are the main points of each of those sections. So this is quite a long one. So it has a lot of things going on, and in the end, it has future work and conclusions and final remarks. Okay, so for you to gain a little bit more confidence, you can use this type of tool and explore it in order to summarize papers and annotate perhaps where and how they can be useful to you in your own research. So I find it as something that is very interesting as a tool to consider, to train yourselves and to support you in creating a protocol on how to use references in your favor. So as you read, you can look for the things we talked about. We can use this tool, and you can even use this tool to annotate your own interpretations and impressions as you go through them. What I would also advocate in the next couple of slides and to wrap things up is that it's for your own research, for your own publications, even for those that you're reading, is always very important to identify where are the impact value of the publication. Okay. And it can be, this impact can be evaluated in many ways. I'm going to talk about the most important ones. First of all, how to look for scientific impact. And the first technique or protocol that you should be using is data citation analysis. So the rule is that the higher the number of citations each publication has, the more impactful it is in the field. Okay. Of course, you have to understand that if a publication was published in the last couple of years, it has not passed enough time for people to read it, apply it in their own research, write and publish their own documents, and then add a number to the number of citations of that original research. So papers that are being published recently necessarily have less citations simply because of time, not because they're not impactful and well perceived in the field. So bear that in mind. This number of citations measure the productivity and the influence of a research. So if it's very cited, and I'm talking hundreds and thousands of citations, then it's a very influential paper in the field, okay? And so it means that it's a number of times each paper has been cited elsewhere. And there are tools that you should be using to identify what is this number for this paper, how many times has been cited. Some of them are, let's say, more comprehensive than others. I would definitely push you for Web of Science. Web of Science and Clarivate Analytics, they're a joint effort, but go search for Web of Science and also Scopus. These are some of the most comprehensive ones in terms of other fields beyond computer science, because they really are very comprehensive. They even include computer science publications. So if you are in the context of protocol labs and this video, albeit all of these guidelines that I'm implying in this or sharing this seminars and videos, they're applicable to any research field. Be aware that normally there are search engines that can be specific of the field, such as CiteSeerX, which is specific to computer science, but Web of Science and Scopus, even those will definitely include computer science publications, and they're the most comprehensive search engines that are out there. Google Scholar might be a first approach, but the number of citations might not be representative reality and updated necessarily. So I would push for those two. Okay, mention that. So that was scientific. In terms of academic impact, what you have to be looking for is the number of citations up to date and the article status. For instance, Web of Science gives something that is incredibly interesting. It categorizes the articles by, was it highly cited and is it a hot paper? And I'm going to show you very quickly how it looks like, because I had it open here. So this is Web of Science search engine. I did a search with the keywords cryptocurrency and security, just out of exercise sake. And what it does, beyond giving me all the hits, I had, how many? 608 results with these keywords searching. But it also gives you something very interesting. It tells me out of those 608, how many are highly cited papers, what they consider hot papers, review articles, early access, and open access. But particularly these first two filters are very interesting because you can, by doing a search with this filter, you can immediately get a sub list. Well, for this type of concepts, what are the top papers that I should be reading to support my research on this? So instead of having 13 pages, I now have one. So these are the top papers. How many? 11 papers. These are the most cited ones. The top one was cited 170 and etc. Okay, there might be more, number higher than that. And this is very important. What's currently a hot topic in this type of subject? Where apparently a paper, one of the hot papers looking at cryptocurrency and security is this one. It's a survey on security of blockchain systems published last year. It already has 164 citations. So these search engines can be very useful for you to identify what are the pool of research or literature that should be reading on these specific topics, because they're very cited and they're hot topics. Or if you want to understand, is this paper, any given paper, very well regarded in the field, search for it in this engine, either here or in Scopus, which I also have on this next screen. and it will show you, it will identify for you if that paper, how many times it was cited. This one, for instance, was cited over 1,000 citations times. So it's definitely one of the key papers in the field about this topic. And so you can get a feeling very quickly how impactful the paper is by looking at these numbers. So these are the two main academic impact tools. So Web of Science and Scopus. I didn't show, but I can go back there. It's quite important because Scopus has something that is very interesting. Right. So if you click here, view all metrics for this publication, it has more detail in terms of impact. It has an historical progression of those citations. And it has something that it's a number. The field-weighted citation impact is something that's becoming quite frequent and popular, which is if this number is higher than 1, it means the document is more cited than expected. And then it has the Plum X metrics. And this is very interesting because it even gives you feedback on the impact on social media like Facebook and Twitter, and in what other types of publication it has been cited. Okay, and how many times has been viewed in different interfaces, and where are the citations coming from? So it has quite a lot of detail that might be interesting for you to explore. But I have more tools to give you. So these would be the main ones academically. For you to, even for your, imagine you're also creating your web page for your research career, okay, for your research profile. Or even if you're trying to understand if this paper is relevant in other aspects and other contexts. Particularly what's becoming nowadays one of the main trends for researchers is try to self-promote their research through social media, okay? So Altmetric is one of the most useful and important tools you can use for engagement tracking. So it gives you exactly what I'm showing you as an output. It gives you the donut that is divided by sectors or by elements. And the idea is that each, it looks at a lot of tools, a lot of communication channels, blogs, Facebooks, and anything that can be associated with the publication. And it looks to see how impactful it was in Twitter, how impactful it was in Reddit, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's very interesting. So what it gives you, I'll show you very quickly as well. So the different colors will have different lengths and expressions according to where they were more expensive. So it has a number associated with, but the colors of the donut represent a different source of attention. And the amount of each color in the donut will change depending on the source's contribution, where it has received more attention. Okay, so for instance, one that has more contributes from mainstream media coverage will have definitely have more reds. Others that come from blogs, they're very talked about in blogs, it comes from the yellow, and so forth. So it's a very visual way to measure social impact. And this is something you might even want to consider to bring to your own web page, because it showcases to whoever is evaluating you if your research is being seen and how it's being perceived in different channels. So it can be very interesting for you, and it can be very interesting to identify if any given paper has been popular and in what channel, and try to consider that channel also to engage in that type of research, even potentially also for collaborations. Other impact tools you might wish to consider is the one called Researcher. It's a free mobile app. There's an app every day, nowadays almost for everything. And it helps you to identify, in identifying who you might want to be citing, who cites you. It's very direct, very interactive tool, very updated. Is based in a social media style feed. And it can be integrated even to reference managers and search engines. So I invite you to explore this tool potentially if you're into this type of very quick and almost daily interaction in terms of promoting and getting feedback on the impact of any particular publication. Kudus is also another one. It's a platform that you can use to showcase your work and track readership and engagement. So you get feedback on who's looking for your research and where they're coming from. You might even be able to identify contact points that might be useful for you. So you can get measurement of the interest that your peers have in your work. And it's very easy to use. It's an option. So that was it from me today. In a nutshell, I try to motivate you to look at papers, perhaps from a more structural point of view, where you should be able to gain sensitivity on the perceived quality of the research and of the document, where to find the key information, and also to use impact-related information and tools in order to track what might be important references that you cannot miss in your own research to identify them, and then use some annotation tools like Scholarly or any of these others of impact that I mentioned to keep yourself updated, and also even potentially as a channel to promote your work, because the research world is most meaningful the more visibility we give to our research. So we are the people that should be, first of all, interested in promoting the usefulness and the impacts of what we have and how they can be interesting for whoever's thinking about these things as we are. So we should be active promoters of our research, and these are some of the tools you might wish to consider to evaluate, or even to consider for your own promotion, and also to identify others that might be meaningful for you to consider. And very often these tools find references that you might have missed. So it might be interesting as an interesting solution to keep yourself updated when it's hard to do so in the middle of the research itself. So that was what I had to give you today in a nutshell. Thank you very much for your participation, and I'm looking forward to see you on the next video, which will be on the topic on how to choose the type of publication. So what type of paper or any other outlet you might wish to consider to publish your research. Thank you very much.